We've not been to the suite for maths before. Normally we do maths in classroom, okay? But we're up here today because we're going to do some special work, okay?
The key Stage 2 numeracy unit about data handling taught by Simon Mills is being analysed by Professor Rosamond Sutherland and Jan Winter. They're ICT and maths specialists at the Graduate School of Education at Bristol University. They're going to assess the contribution ICT can make to the effective teaching of mathematics at Key Stage 2.
There are different amounts of each different colour.
To teach the unit, Simon brought his Year 4 class to the ICT suite. The room has 15 workstations and an interactive whiteboard that he can control from the front of the class or through a wireless keyboard.
18.
He began the first lesson with the children on the carpet. Then he worked on the whiteboard from the wireless keyboard before dividing the pupils into pairs to work at the different workstations.
Well, it intrigued me that they were able very readily to move between the computer work and then coming together as a whole class. And when I've been in other sorts of computer rooms, I haven't seen that happen quite so well. It also intrigued me the actual shape around the perimeter. So instead of actually putting the computers around the outside of the wall, which has a fairly stark feel to it, they came in and out in a nice curve shape, and that seemed to create collections of children working together.
Lucy, can you come and help me?
Pupils who had learnt how to do something that others wanted to learn how to do would be called over and would go and support them. And that seemed to happen very kind of organically within the class. They seemed very free to share experiences with one another and to feel as though they were both contributing to other children's learning, but also, I'm sure, learning more deeply themselves as well by having to express their understanding to others in order to help others understand it. It seemed to work very naturally.
You know where it says plot area when you just have a dot over it? That's where, and then you can colour in that as well. Click on that. Oh, okay.
But what was also interesting was that the spaces within those bays were fairly large so that Simon could go in there as well. So it wasn't like when you have rows of computers in a classroom and the teacher can't get between those rows. You know, the teacher could move very well between the clusters of computers, and the children could communicate across those clusters, and they could move from working at the computer to working together on the floor space in front of the whiteboard very easily. So it seemed extremely flexible. I think it's probably one of the best spaces that I've ever seen.
Early on in the first lesson, Simon sat with the pupils and used the wireless keyboard to upload the data the children themselves had collected.
He was collecting their data in a way that helped to focus their attention on the board. It's quite easy for children to get cut off from being engaged in that sort of activity. It's a bit boring to just watch other children's numbers being collected. But because he was sitting back with them, he was part of the group, the focus wasn't on him. The focus was very definitely on these numbers appearing on the whiteboard. And they were able to then make the comparisons as the data was emerging. They were able to see where they came in the list, whether their numbers were higher or lower than other numbers. And it just made the whole process feel quite engaging, I think.
You got really interested in the activity, even for me as an outsider watching that, and you start asking questions. Does it relate to the length of the name? And these are the sorts of ideas that the children started to bring forward as well.
The focus of the unit was the idea of frequency in data handling. Simon used a simple proposition to get the children thinking about it, the frequency of a particular colour of sweets in one tube. Did the idea of using sweets worry the experts?
Lots of problems to do with data handling can be sensitive, so sort of problems that might be around people's height or their weight or their shoe size, and all of those are quite sensitive in various respects. So I think, from my point of view, this sweets problem has less issues associated with some of the more personal things that sometimes people choose to focus on when they're looking at frequency.
Absolutely. I mean, if we want to engage with children and talk about their real lives, then it's a little over fussy to be worrying about whether we're using a context like that.
The data handling project that Simon chose needed more than just the ICT suite and its hardware. It needed software tools, and the tool he chose was the spreadsheet software Excel.
And I think that it's really important that in the context of the mathematics lesson, that children use real tools in real context to develop real outcomes.
That's, in a way, quite a risky choice, I think, to use with children, because it's a very complex piece of software. The depths of its capabilities are enormous, and it's a possibility that children might get sucked into all kinds of confusions. But the advantage of it, as Simon describes, is how it's a live piece of software. It's a real piece of software. It's used in real life. What he enabled them to do this lesson, I think, was make a start on using Excel so that they begin to understand its capabilities a small amount at a time. They're focusing on, first of all, creating a frequency table and then using the chart wizard. And that's relatively small steps, although, as we see, there are still some problems in that, in creating some of the features of the graphs that they want to create.
There's been a debate for a long time, actually, whether or not primary school children should have cut-down versions of software or whether they should use the sort of big grown-up tool. And I have to admit that I'm someone who's always argued they should use the big grown-up tool, because I think that means that they can then extend their work in all sorts of directions. What might be a disadvantage is if they can't manage that grown-up tool to start with. And I think in this example here, we can see how putting the data in as a table was quite straightforward for the children. But when it came to labelling the axes of the bar chart, then that wasn't quite so straightforward.
Axis labels, are they?
Quite often with these grown-up tools, if you spend a bit more time thinking about it before you introduce it, you can actually structure it in such a way that it's accessible for younger learners, but then you can expand the tool as they get more and more confident with it.
The second lesson was devoted to making a bar chart from the frequency tables the children had made earlier. But a lot had problems finding their files on the network.
Very often these school networks or university networks are set up in such a way that they're not the easiest of things to use compared to what we might have when we use a sort of standalone computer. So, it may be that if someone spent some time on it, that actual network and the way of getting to the files could have been simplified in some way. I've worked with pupils in the classroom using ICT for years, and although we might say these children were having some difficulty navigating the network, they did actually manage to get their files, most of them, and they did actually manage to save them. And years ago, pupils were having real difficulty just saving their files. We used to consider that to be a very difficult thing to do, and yet these were 8-year-olds who were doing that. But the bonus of the network is that you can get everybody's files up quickly.
So it was tremendously powerful for them all to be able to sit together and look at one another's work and critique it and evaluate it and share their ideas.
I think the challenge in mathematics generally is the language. I think that what's really important is for children to be able to use the language. I don't think children are actually able to kind of understand fully what the terms mean until they've had a chance to use it in conversation and to come to some kind of agreement themselves about what it means.
What about the educational value of the ICT? How did the experts think it added to the numeracy unit Simon was teaching?
The power of that sequence of lessons was the way in which they enable the children to engage in the discussion and use the language. And Simon's key focus is on the language of frequency, understanding it, getting to grips with it as a mathematical idea. And this way of working together really enables that to happen, I think, because of the variety of experiences the children have and the way that Simon brings them back, gets them to come back together as a collaborative group at various points through the work they're doing, so that they're not left to flounder or struggle on their own or work on their own ideas for too long. They have just enough time to develop some things and then they share them. So there's a tremendous amount of collaborative work going on in that discussion.
And I think in the sort of history of the use of ICT in schools, there's been a tendency for teachers either to encourage the children to work individually or in pairs on computers and then sort of leave them doing that and never bring them back together, or take too much control from the front. And I think what Simon is doing is he's balancing that. The children have the freedom to work on the computer on their own and to produce their own sort of work, but then they come together, they share their work, and they discuss the kind of advantages and disadvantages of the different things that they've produced.
The ICT seemed to be allowing them to tackle issues in more depth, because some of the mechanical, the mundane, the more surface activities were being done for them by the computer. So they were able to get to the more important deep issues. The colouring in was a click of the mouse, whereas colouring in can take over bar charts if you're not careful.
One of the things that's really interesting is the way it seems that Simon takes risks. In a sense, he'd taken risks using a sort of grown-up spreadsheet with this age of pupils, but it was a risk that mostly paid off, because for most of the time they were engaged. I could imagine many teachers would say, well, that wouldn't be possible with my class. You know, you can do it. And they might even start saying, well, these are particularly special groups of pupils, because that's what teachers tend to say if they see something happening that they think wouldn't work in their classroom. They'll then say, well, it's all right with your kids. You know, you've got this group. But as Simon keeps emphasising, this is not a particularly straightforward group of children. I mean, we saw them engaging, but it's not because there's anything special about the children. It's because of the way Simon worked with the children that was important.
He was encouraging the children to see mathematics as part of the curriculum in a very integrated way. Mathematics itself is an important tool, which enables you to solve problems, and that's what those children were doing. They're using that tool to solve a problem, and it's a very real and live problem, but they're applying mathematical principles to solving it.
I think the important thing also to me is that it was what we call a good problem. You know, I'm not saying there aren't other good problems, but this particular one, looking at the frequency of colours in this tube of sweets, was a really good problem, I think, because you know, the visual representations of the sweets related to the visual representation of the graph. I mean, we didn't see any evidence they didn't understand the problem.
Now this is like that. Yeah? You see how this is very...
I think if any teacher wants to do this kind of activity, they've got to do it for themselves. So they've got to try it out, they've got to take some sweet tubes, they've got to look at the frequencies, they've got to understand the problem from the mathematical and the statistical point of view, they've got to try it out with a spreadsheet, they've got to look at all the issues to do with changing from a table to a graph. They've really got to get into the problem if they're going to take the risk of working it, using it in the classroom.
The advantage of taking on all those risks and all that work that Ros has just talked about is the motivation and the engagement and the opportunity for real shared collaborative work that seemed to offer. And I think it's also about offering children a variety of learning experiences. So making mathematics lessons interesting, making sure that they are about something, giving them a context that is meaningful to them. And all of those things, I think, are the payoff to the undoubted work that's gone into preparing a lesson like that.
So you can give yourselves a pat on the back. Well done. And if you're sitting up really straight and quiet, you might even be able to go for lunch.
This mathematically is a starting point that goes an awful long way, and you really could take it into a whole different range of much more complex contexts, which would take the mathematics to all sorts of different levels. Yeah, and indeed the ICT skills. You know, Simon was working with a particular level of both mathematical complexity and ICT complexity, and both of those things can be upscaled according to the needs of the groups that you're working with.